In May of 2019, our co-host Andrew Kleiman headed down to George Mason University to speak on a panel he was invited to.
Andrew was invited to be on a panel put on by their SDS chapter at George Mason University.
That's Anja Clark, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which hosts our podcast. And if you recognize her voice, that's because her voice is the one that reads MHI's Who We Are statement on every episode of Radio Free Humanity.
So on the panel were Andrew Kleiman, Rick Wolf, Boots Briley, who's a hip-hop artist and filmmaker, recently made a film against capitalism, and a graduate student who was just a through-and-through Stalinist, who's part of the PSL group that is very Stalinistic.
And that's Party for Socialism and Liberation, correct?
Right.
They say they're for it. They're really against both of them.
Exactly. And we will get to that. Today we bring you the story of our co-host Andrew Kleiman's journey last May of 2019 to George Mason University, where he found himself in a room full of Stalinist tankies. Andrew and I will be interviewing Anja Clark, who was there at the panel, and who has written a lot since about the resurgence of Stalinism and young people today. And of course, today's conversation is accompanied by an all-horror music soundtrack. You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
To hear more episodes, read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also leave a donation there at the website. While our podcast is hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the positions and views of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Hey, if you're searching for a podcast on some kind of podcast app, your best bet is to type in the full title of the podcast. That's Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist Podcast. You can also stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org and pick up the RSS feed and feed that into whatever app you use. In just a moment, we'll be talking with Anja Clark about tankies. But first, as we always do, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events and recent news. Last Thursday, the U.S. military assassinated Iran's military chief and second most powerful leader, General Qasem Soleimani, near Baghdad airport in Iraq. It was carrying out the explicit personally issued order of President Donald J. Trump. Those are the opening lines of an editorial published on January 6th on Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org's publication with sober senses. The editorial is called Stop Trump's Self-Interested Drive to War Against Iran and Against the American People. And the editorial is the subject of our current events section today that Andrew and I will be discussing. The editorial goes on to say, this dramatic and frightening act of escalation of hostilities was not an inevitable result of some logic of imperialism, nor was it an inevitable result of the drive toward war with Iran that hawks in the U.S. national security establishment have long fomented. So, Andrew, this idea that this escalation of tensions with Iran is the result of U.S. imperialism and or part of this inevitable unstoppable drive toward war is a narrative we hear in a little bit of the anti-war left. So why is that narrative called into question by this MHI editorial? You know, what's wrong with that narrative?
Right. I had a hand in writing this editorial of ours, and we think that the evidence is pretty clear that this was Trump's doing, and that Trump has his own personal motives for the escalation against Iran and against the regime in Iran. And in fact, the editorial highlights this by saying, stop Trump's self-interested drive to war with Iran. And so the idea is, this is not something that comes from the inevitable, logic, so to speak, of imperialism, nor is it really part and parcel of, the hawks, the neocons' drive to war with Iran, spanning over decades now. It has to do with the threats that Donald Trump faces from the impeachment, the trial in the Senate, all of the investigations, and what he's doing is protecting his own liberty and his own property by trying to stay in office come what may, because the moment he leaves office, he's subject to prosecution. His companies are in danger. And what Trump cares about more than anything is himself, and his wealth. And he has the power to basically, make policy and kill people, etc. And he doesn't care about that. And he's doing it for himself, his own interests. We know from the New York Times that it was told by senior people in the Department of Defense and people in Trump's administration that when this decision to assassinate Soleimani was, on the table there, and they were discussing it with Trump, the officials were flabbergasted. That's the term used in the New York Times. They were flabbergasted when Trump chose to assassinate Soleimani. It was the most extreme action they put on a list of possibilities, and they put it there to, get him to look, you don't want to go for that extreme, you don't want to go for that extreme, try something in the middle, and he chose the most extreme. They had advised him against it, and they were like, oh my God, now what's going to happen? According to the New York Times, they were, quote, immediately alarmed about the prospect of Iranian retaliatory strikes on American troops in the region. So explain to me how this is part and parcel either of the logic of imperialism, such that, it's just the inevitable result of that, or of, the neocon and Pentagon desire, so to speak, for war with Iran. It doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, I agree that it doesn't make much sense, especially since, as we know, of course it is a fact that the U.S. government has a whole national security apparatus devoted to researching and making policy around the strategic interests of the U.S. and U.S. capital, and that there are often sort of imperialist motives behind some of that, but that Donald Trump doesn't listen to briefings. He is not interested in other people's opinions. He shoots from the hip and acts very impulsively, based usually on instinct and his immediate short-term interest of controlling the news cycle. And that's different than past presidents. I think there's this instinct in the anti-war movement to label this the same way we label all other U.S. policy historically in the Middle East as imperialist.
This is very hard for a lot of people to come to grips with when you've got something different, especially when people are writing statements about like an emergency situation like we had, and I think still have, with the escalation with Iran. It's hard for people to kind of like shift gears. They're much more inclined to repeat what they regard as truisms. There's another issue here, though, which is the desire and tendency of the left to normalize Trumpism. The terrible reluctance to recognize that there's an extraordinary danger here, that this is not, capitalist, imperialist business as usual going on. And we've seen that again and again, and I think the ascribing the escalation to some logic of imperialism or to, the neocons and stuff, it's part and parcel of that same normalization of Trumpism, and I think that's very dangerous.
So why does the editorial that MHI put out and that you helped write, why does it take issue with this idea that this escalation with Iran is part of an unstoppable process?
Right. So the point isn't just, here is the actual reason for the drive to war. Trump's trying to protect his liberty and his property. I mean, okay, that's a factual question. But it's not just academic because, okay, why does that matter? Well, one reason it matters is when we see that the drive to war is specific to Trump. It doesn't flow from a logic of imperialism as such, whatever that might mean. It isn't just an inevitable consequence of decades of the neocons and the hawks fomenting a war with Iran, once we see that it's specific to Trump, it gives us more hope that it can be turned around. And that's the real thing that we have to do here, is to stop this drive to war. And it's much easier to stop if it is, being driven by the motives of one single individual, and there's no inevitability to that drive to war. Okay, so the positions that we are criticizing are not only factually incorrect, they're demoralizing. Okay, and that's the last thing you want when you're trying to fight an impending war, is to be demoralized from the start.
MHI's editorial is not the first one to make the wagging the dog reference in explicating Trump's motivations for escalating things with Iran, but the editorial does go farther than a lot of people and talking about those reasons. I mean, this is not just about winning re-election or even taking the focus away from impeachment. This is about even more objective sort of existential problems for Trump.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we focused so much on this is not just about him trying to win re-election or, distract, but he is trying to protect his liberty and his property, from prosecutions. The reason we stress this is it's a much more dangerous situation we face. His drive to war is much more objectively rooted. I mean, you could imagine that even Donald Trump would say, okay, I am not going to plunge the world, into total chaos just for the purpose of being reelected because I happen to want to be president. But we face a much tougher self-interest on his part, a much more objective compulsion on his part to drive us to war and to disaster, because if he does not remain in office, then his liberty and his property are under very serious threat, and that is the ultimate thing those are the ultimate things that Trump cares about. So I think it is unimaginable, absolutely unimaginable, that if he needs to protect his life and liberty, and property, if he needs to plunge the world into war, even catastrophic war, I cannot imagine that he would not take that step. I think it is inevitable that he will take the step if he has that opportunity, which is why the editorial then concludes what we have to do is get him removed from office by any means possible. That is the best way, and maybe the only way we have to stop this drive to war. Because as long as he has power, this drive to war is just pushing forward.
Well, that's all the time we have for our current events section in this episode. Up next, we return to our conversation with Anja Clark about tankies. So when you got to the room, were you expecting to be in a room full of tankies?
Andrew was suspicious, I think. He can speak for himself. But the way they sent him questions in advance, and the questions were kind of peculiar. I had no idea what to expect because it never crossed my mind that young people were Stalinists. I just had missed this whole phenomenon, which has been going on apparently for a few years, of youth being dominated in their discourse of the left by this Stalinism.
Okay, so if you weren't expecting it, at what point during the panel did you realize there were so many tankies in the room?
Oh, it was throughout. Certainly the presentation by the graduate student was hair-raising. And Boots Briley, who's a Maoist, his presentation was pretty hair-raising. So it became apparent early on, but what was particularly shocking to me was that the audience was sympathetic to them. And when they had discussion after the presentations, questions from the audience, they were also rooted in the most kind of vulgar Stalinism of old, denying that there had been any famines or massacres or shootings or anything like that. It was all a CIA myth, a big lie. They talked about the invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia being good things. The Russians were just trying to get them, to stay in the socialist fold when they were being lured by the CIA, and incredible nonsense that I had no idea was still out there in the world, or out there other than in antiquated, ridiculous literature from decades ago.
So it sounds like this isn't just Stalinism in the sense of like, oh, we're for central planning and the dictatorship of the proletariat. And yes, the Soviet Union had some problems, but we'll fix them in the future with the right technocratic solutions or more democratic solutions. This is like Stalinism in the sense of naked sort of post-truth apologetics, saying, there was nothing wrong with the Soviet Union, and all the bad things you hear about the Soviet Union and Stalinism are just lies created by the CIA and Western propaganda, right?
Exactly. And I was expecting at worst the kind of soft Stalinism you mentioned first, although it's not soft, but I'm an old person, and all my life I've had to deal with people who were what we call Stalinists, with a capital small s, and that they were very sympathetic to the Soviet Union and did think it could be reformed, and thought that it would be reformed, and they just needed a little more than 70 years to get their act together, but it was still socialism at its base. And I'm used to arguing with those people all my life. But even when I was young, in the 60s, nobody was taken seriously if they argued that Stalin was a good guy and everything he was doing was good for the people, because that was just too ridiculous. We knew it wasn't true, and we thought only, very old people who remembered the Russian Revolution would have such a line and cling to the idea that it was revolutionary in spite of all the facts. So you can imagine my surprise when 50 years later this is not only still around, but comes much stronger than it was in my youth.
It sounds very much like the sort of vulgar anti-truth, anti-historical arguments you hear from Holocaust deniers.
Yeah, I mean, most of that was coming either from that graduate student or from specific members of the audience. I mean, my take on it is that Boots Riley and Rick Wolff were running they had problems line, where the problems were never, of course, specified, nor was it ever said who represented the problem, the ruling class in these societies or the masses, fighting them. They were just, they're not perfect. We're not totally out of it. We're not being total denialists and say these are perfect societies. But they weren't perfect. But let's attack capitalism. So it was not like one unified line as I see it coming out of all of them.
But when the graduate student on the panel started spouting all this crazy post-truth Stalinist stuff about how the Hungarian uprising was all just a bunch of CIA officers and Nazis, did Boots Riley and Rick Wolff challenge him on that, or were they just kind of happy to have that be part of their general, presentation, to be part of their general leftism?
They seemed content. They didn't interrupt him to say anything. Boots Riley interrupted everybody constantly and hogged all the time. So whereas Andrew was kept to his time allotments to answer questions and things, Riley just talked constantly, but he didn't have much to say. And nobody said to the guy, this is nonsense until later in the program when we did it. But it was really pitiful and shocking, because I didn't know that this is common now. Now I know it's common.
So this was a surprise to you at the George Mason University panel, but since then you've done some writing and research about this phenomenon of resurgent Stalinism or Tankieism, especially amongst young people today. And we'll link to your Left Forum talk from 2019 about this topic. How did you start to piece together that this was something that extended beyond your experience at George Mason, but was actually like a growing problematic phenomenon?
Well, I don't know if it's growing but it's certainly grown. Maybe with luck it'll be shrinking. I am organizational secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. So I'm the first person who contacts new people who write in to us or subscribe to our notices and letters and things. And lately we've gotten quite a few young people, I'd say particularly in the last year and a half. I mean, very young people, high school and early 20s. And I began talking with them, and turned out that most of them had a very similar story of their political evolution. And it began when they were 15, something like that, in high school. And they didn't know anything except that they hate this world and they wanted to find out what socialism was, because they'd heard about socialism. For many of them, it came through Bernie Sanders and the DSA. They heard the word socialism. So they went to look for socialism. And where they went to look, of course, was the internet. And particularly internet speakers and writers who their friends referred them to. So they went on the internet and they found these hardline Stalinists who had these fantastic stories. And the youth, not knowing very much history, said, "Oh my heavens, I believe this because I know that our teachers and parents and everybody lies to us and our government. So here's an alternative universe that's got some historians claiming to be experts who know something better. And it's a whole different picture of history and what happened in the Soviet Union and also to some extent in China and other places." So they read this stuff and they believed it. And 4 or 5 people at least have told me told me virtually identical stories about how they believed this stuff for some years and even argued and even joined PSL or joined some other group. For years now, they're so young that their years is not a lot of years, but like some of them got involved with it at age 15 and were staunch participants in it for 5 years. And only when they hit 20 or so, they began to realize that that wasn't the truth, that it was all a bunch of baloney, and they began to look around for alternatives to that. And that's how these youth found Marxist-Humanism, because they had gone through this Stalinism and were now looking for a real alternative to it and to existing society.
Do you have any sense of why they started to question this tankyism and look for alternatives?
Oh, I guess they studied a little more about the world and realized that was nonsense. They were looking around for other things. They found other friends besides those initial friends who said, "Oh, you have to go on there and listen to Fur and listen to this Finnish Bolshevik is a big name on that." And these people just literally dominate YouTube. That's what you get when you start looking for socialism. And that's all they knew how to do at first. I guess they started to hear it wasn't true. And so they looked around.
It almost sounds like you're fielding emails from like cult survivors. What are these people saying to you when they write you emails?
They write in and they say, "Well, I'm a Marxist-Humanist," and I, was so surprised at first. I said, "My heavens, they haven't even contacted us before, and yet they share our philosophy." But they didn't necessarily mean our specific Marxist-Humanism. They meant some generic form that the internet has homogenized us and other thinkers into, but they knew, at least they knew there was a difference between Marxism and Stalinism, and there was a difference between humanism and Stalinism. So they wanted to explore it further. So they did start watching our stuff once they found us.
And the other side is aware of us. The other side knows us. I can't remember whether it was one of these youth or somebody else, but they were connected with one of these Stalinist groups and said, "Stay away from the writings of Kleiman." I was told that.
I'll quote from Larry, who's written a draft of an article for us. I don't know if it'll ever get done, but
This is one of the young people that.
yeah, this is a very young person.
Right.
He says that the reason that the Stalinists dominate YouTube and Reddit is because social media in general is their domain, and Stalinism has a certain appeal to the young, and we can talk about that if you want. But basically, they had thought before they found, quote, socialism, the Stalinist kind, that there is no alternative. That famous line that's dominated the political culture for several decades. So they were so happy to find anything that called itself anti-capitalist, socialist. And then they began to see what wasn't true about it. Some of them read Kleiman, or they read Dostoevskaya, and they compared what they saw there, and they saw the explanations of Russia as a state capitalist society, not as a socialist society. So as they started to learn a little bit about actual Marxism, and they could for themselves see that statified property and totalitarianism are not the essence of Marxism or socialism at all, and it's something very different. And they became more sophisticated. This guy, Larry, he said he saw Trotsky had turned state property into a fetish. Dostoevskaya was the only one who saw through this, and that most of socialism today appears to be red capitalism. Wasn't, in fact, breaking with the categories of capitalism, the hallmarks of capitalism, was not attacking value production or capital or wage labor and the other categories of capitalism that have to be transcended. So as they got more learned and more sophisticated, they saw that that was not socialism. But, Hegelian Marxists like us always talk about the second negation. You have to get beyond first negation, which is just what you're opposed to, and you have to see the second negation coming to the fore, which is, what you're for and what you might create. So it seems that a lot of people have to go through this first negation of rejecting this society wholeheartedly, and whatever they find, then they embrace temporarily, and it takes them a while to get to second negation. So Larry, that was me. But going back to Larry, he talks about also anarchism. That a lot of these youth turned to anarchism when they left Stalinism. But he thinks anarchism is less popular than what they call Marxist-Humanism. Because it lacks history, it lacks a perspective on the future, and other than, description of a different society. And doesn't have a revolutionary philosophy of how to get there. So that's why he came to us. But as I say, I heard nearly the identical, nearly word for word descriptions of the development by a lot of young people.
That's very interesting. What do you think is attractive about this neo-Stalinism to these young people?
Well, some of them are just rebelling against what they know and what they've grown up with. That's not enough of an explanation, because one reason I was so shocked when I was at George Mason, because I didn't know this phenomenon was out there, but also because it seemed to make no sense. If you want to rebel against the world you know, you could go to radical Islam or to following Iran's government or something. You pick something very unpopular and cling to it. But why they would pick long over with and discredited political theory, I had no idea. And particularly because Stalinism didn't succeed in the end, When I was young, there were plenty of Stalinists around, but that's because that was, quote, actually existing socialism. But after it fell, what's the big attraction? So it might be in part that that's all they found on the internet, which really says a lot about this very scary power of the internet. So it's both, I think, the natural rebelliousness of youth and the fact that that's all they could find, and they were too young to know much history or philosophy to be able to evaluate it at the time. But there's also some possibility and thought that this is attractive to people. Attractive to people who bought the whole Trump view that truth is bendable. There's your truth, there's my truth. Why not have a totally alternative reality? And there are people who are attracted by authoritarianism, which goes hand in hand with creating your own reality, right? And that some people admire the strength or whatever of Stalin, just like some do of Trump. So they were happy to get into this alternative world. There's also this idea of a mythic past, which some of these writers talk about. Jason Stanley, expert on fascism's book on how fascism works, says there's often a mythic past they're harking back to. So, one immediately thinks of Trump trying to create a world in which white men were dominant over everything and had this lovely time, because there weren't any blacks or women interfering with them. But why young people should be interested in a mythic time, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's because they watch too much, video games and movies about wonderful mythical societies. It seems a little weird to me. I would more likely go with the explanation that that's all they found at first, and they had to go through that to get to the other side of look at something intelligent. But what's really scary is this idea that it has to do with people liking authoritarianism or liking power and what it can do for them. So let me just mention this website. Where's his name? There's a website with an article by someone who was criticizing and breaking with these tankies and got terribly attacked by other people, and not just attacked on the internet, but people were messing up his website and threatening him physically and stuff. Here, his name is Solar Punk Anarchist. It's one word. Solar Punk Anarchist wrote a long article about his personal experiences, and he suggests that normally you think that advocating for violence and killing people and everything would be abhorrent, but it's only abhorrent if you're the one being oppressed, suppressed, killed, etc., right? If you're the one with the power who is doing this to other people who you don't like, it may be very attractive because you were able to do away with your enemies. So that's a really scary thought too, but it may be part of the attraction.
Because it's the internet, and because people, their first exposure to Stalinism is this stuff, you're going to get a lot of people who are of this type that they like to dominate, they like to bully, that they are authoritarian, because those are the kinds of people who predominate on the net in general. So those who predominate on the internet left are going to be the same kinds of people, who troll, who bully, who intimidate. So there might be different motivations of other people, but this is going to come to the fore and be predominant, because that's just what is predominant on the internet generally.
We've been using the word tanky, but for those listeners who aren't familiar with the term, Anne, can you explain what that refers to?
It just refers to Stalinist left people. It comes from the fact that the Soviet Union sent in tanks and crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 and the Czech Revolution in 1968. And so it's the worst kind of association you could give to the Soviet Union, to say, oh, we're all for sending in the tanks and mowing down and shooting down the masses in the street. And this came out actually at George Mason when maybe Andrew wants to talk about it, but he started to talk about the Hungarian Revolution as an example of a great revolution. And some people in the audience got very incensed and said, "Oh."
Yeah, they said, what's your like shining examples of anti-imperialist struggle, right? That was one of the questions I received a week in advance, and I knew something was up with questions. That was one of the questions that caught my attention. So I wasn't going to back down, So it's not that it's untrue. It is a shining example of tremendous struggle against Stalinist imperialism, Stalinist Russia. But it's not what they meant by the question.
But I didn't realize it's not a brand new expression or anything. It comes apparently from the British left, and in the British left there is a much more tolerance than we see in the U.S. for, the established left. Much more tolerance there for people who hark back to the Soviet Union as great. In fact, all kinds of sections of the Labor Party are still tied to that concept of socialism, whereas in the U.S. you don't hear that, at least not in public, that was a great thing. So apparently those people have been called tankies in the UK for some time.
So, Andrew, I want to ask a question to follow up on something you said earlier. You said that you received the questions that were going to be asked at this panel ahead of time, and that when you read the questions, you got suspicious that perhaps you were walking into a room full of neo-Stalinists. So I'm curious about what the clues were in the questions. Like, I'm assuming they weren't asking questions like, was Stalin a great guy, right?
No,
right?
no, nothing,
so,
nothing, nothing.
It was a little more subtle than that, right? So what were you, I'm curious to what your clues were, how your bat sense picked up on this. It might be useful to our listeners so they could develop their own tanky radar.
I think you have to be prepared all the time for everything. When I saw the questions ahead of time, I thought they were odd, but I didn't identify them politically.
Your alarm bells didn't go off in your head.
No, because I thought it was a mishmash of students had put together who, weren't clear on what they wanted out of the panel, and it's a little this and a little of that. But Andrew discerned a little more.
I was sent a list of 7 questions in advance. Here are the ones that tipped me off. Quote, Western superpowers such as the US and the UK launched extensive anti-socialism propaganda campaigns throughout the 20th century in order to condemn the left as inhumane and the ultimate threat to, quote, freedom, close quote. How do you respond to these attacks on the morality of socialism? How would you deconstruct the capitalist myth of the free market? And why do you feel that a planned economy is more effective?
Okay. All right, that is kind of a giveaway.
Thrown in there. And that's all one question, although it's like 7 questions there. Okay, so the next question that tipped me off, quote, what is the role of student movements in the growth, support, and fight for a socialist future? What is a liberation struggle that isn't necessarily a student movement that inspires you and you think provides an important example for resisting colonialism and imperialism?
Okay, so why is that a tip-off that there's some tankyism involved?
It's a tip-off that it's third worldist and, quote, anti-imperialist, that anti-West, anti-imperialism. Can I prove it? Only in retrospect. But my antenna went up. So, it's not hard to take an educated guess and say, oh, God, look what I'm walking into. Well, a wall of Russian tanks here, No, it sounds funny, but really, like Stalin started off, when he started off, he wasn't Stalin. He became Stalin, and all of these people, they represent a tremendous threat, even though they don't have power right now. So it's not just us disagreeing with people. We've got people who would imprison and shoot and do everything to us. That's what we're dealing with.
All right. You asked earlier, Brendan, about what's the attraction of tankyism. And some of the youth I've talked to and my experience with non youth would indicate that it's the anti war, anti imperialism mentality that dominates the left and dominates the youth. After all, some of these youth have their whole lives been fighting against the war in Iraq and the other U.S. wars in the Middle East and those aided and abetted by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And so they consider their anti-war, anti-imperialist positions to be the root and heart of their leftism. Maybe that's all they know of leftism. So when you're an anti-imperialist, then there's a tendency for these youth, again, if they're only seeing simplistic explanations, just to be anti-U.S., right? No, even though there are plenty of other imperialists around these days who are invading and colonizing the world, they take it, well, the U.S. is the worst, and the U.S. is the source of all the world's problems, and the U.S. is the most advanced capitalist, so it's driving everything. So they go from being anti-imperialism to anti-U.S., and then it's a quick step to the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they'll befriend anyone who's opposing the U.S. And this is because of very, very limited thinking, right? That you have to choose among existing oppressive governments. You can't think outside the box and think about wholesale human liberation. So I'm sure that's true.
Hence, groups like the Workers' World Party and the Party for Socialism and Liberation have been known to defend and spread all sorts of ridiculous post-truth apologetics about all sorts of horrible dictators and regimes all over the world, from apologizing for Assad in Syria to defending Saddam Hussein.
The Workers' World and the PSL is an offshoot of that, but before there was the split, Workers' World was the only group on the left that outright supported the Tiananmen massacre.
And I'm sure they still do, as people do. Right now, I'm following what's going on in Hong Kong, and the U.S. Maoist groups are condemning that and saying, you know, even though it's the whole population, that it's all CIA agents and all just paid agitators and all that, because the Chinese government can do no wrong. But I remember way back when the Shining Path movement in Peru, when they were a Maoist group and they were slaughtering the peasants and they were being defended. I remember once having by chance having a literature table put next to theirs, to Workers' World, and I had literature about Peru and the opposite of Shining Path, and I was afraid, frankly. I was afraid they would attack me. I was afraid to get up and leave the table for a moment if I didn't have a comrade to take it over, because I thought they would at least destroy my literature and maybe assault me. But that's been for years and years, you know, because that was back in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
There's a lot of authoritarianism among people who say that they're on the left. You know, this is the problem I think we face, is that we have the sense of, you know, we all mean well, we're all really for the same things, and that we can then intervene, you know, to convince people who are like us that our ideas are better because we're really on the same side. And I'm not at all convinced that that's the case. And I would like to ask a question, going back to the stuff that Anne was saying about these young people believing, you know, that Stalin did not commit crimes humanity, that there was no famine, and all the rest. So, to my mind, we face this throughout society now in a big way with post-truth and the Trump's base, and we hear all these things about what they believe. And I'm very skeptical, because what they believe, it just sounds really, really weird. Conspiracy theories, and you believe Trump when it's obvious Trump just lies all the time, right? So are these people totally out out of touch such that they actually believe what Trump is saying. Okay, I think we have to make a distinction. When philosophers talk about belief, they mean belief that something is factually accurate. So I'd like to make a distinction between belief that something is the case versus belief in. I think in the main, it's not that Trump's base doesn't see that he's a liar. It's not that they believe that the words coming out of his mouth are factually accurate, but they believe in him the way people believe in God. So my question is, do these people believe, these Stalinist myths as factual accuracies, or do they believe in Stalinism? And it might sound like an abstract question, but it goes directly, as I see it, to how we engage with this. If these are people who actually believe that this is the case and that is the case, we should be able to convince them otherwise just by talking to them, exposing them to the facts, and it'll all work out. If they believe in this stuff, we're dealing with people who are very unlike us, and we can't use fact-based methods of engagement to deal with this problem that we face, wherein the left is being perverted and turned into its opposite. It's fascist authoritarianism, basically. So it's a long question because I had to sort of lay out a bunch of things, but I'd like to know what Anne thinks, and I'd like to know what you think, Brendan.
Well, I can't say for sure. My impression is that they actually believe those are all lies made up by Western historians who are in some kind of conspiracy to suppress the truth of what went on there, and of course by the CIA or NSA or whoever is the government main actor today. But that, yes, they believe it. They're not saying it was okay to kill millions of people in the furtherance of the Soviet Union. They're saying those people were not killed. Maybe a few were killed, a couple were killed, collateral damage, but nothing like the huge atrocities that actually went down.
So the implication should be that by exposing these people to facts, we can change their minds.
I don't know, but I know that's what the youth have described to me, that it was when they began to question. They saw things that they knew couldn't be true or weren't true. They began to read Marx, and they saw that it had nothing to do with what the Stalinists were saying it was all about. That then, once they stopped believing totally, then they started thinking for themselves, and they found more and more cracks, and then they rejected the whole thing.
And, I suspect that it's not just being confronted with a certain critical mass of facts that might make one break with a tanky belief system, but also being presented with an alternative way of thinking, an alternative, like, worked out way of still being a leftist or, anti-capitalist or anti-war, that is, a non-tanky alternative. I'm envisioning someone who maybe starts going to anti-war demos, starts waving around like Answer Coalition signs and stickers because they pass them out for free at protests. Maybe they don't realize that they're a front group, and then they get a flyer for some like Answer Coalition thing that's an Assad apologist lecture, and then before long they're like selling Workers' World papers or something, because it seems like a natural, inevitable part of like their development as an anti-war, anti-capitalist person, because they don't see there's an alternative way of being anti-war and anti-capitalist, because that's just what they're immediately presented with as like the natural evolution of those sort of political leanings. So I suspect it's not just reading a history book or something that in which they're confronted with the horrors of Stalinism, but also having a worked out way of exercising their legitimate frustration at our capitalist and imperialist world that doesn't lead right back into Stalinism.
I think that's true, and I didn't really answer adequately before when you tried to give me an opening to talk about what's Marxist-Humanism's appeal. The youth I've been in discussion with are very intelligent, and they go out and explore things once they have the idea in their heads that everything they've been taught about the left was wrong and about the Soviet Union was wrong. So they're still on the internet, however, because that's the only source of knowledge they know. I'm talking about, when the 15-year-olds turn 18 and they start to find out a little more. So they look around on the internet, and there's something called Marxist-Humanism, and there's a lot called anarchism. And so they think they had to pick between those three things, the Stalinism, Marxist-Humanism, if they even see anything called Marxist-Humanism. There hasn't been for a long time. There's absolutely nothing. Or anarchism. So if they're studying any Marx, they can clearly see who is talking about what Marx was talking about, his categories of what makes up capitalism, his view of what the opposite to capitalism is, and then they would come to us. So it has to do with not just telling people, read our website, we have such good stuff and such good positions on things. It has to do with them really getting inside the internal logic of a group that's for human liberation and human development through human activity and human thought. And that's very abstract, but once they can grasp some of what we mean by that and what we're all about, then it's very attractive, I think, and very attractive to a lot of people, unless you have absolutely committed yourself to authoritarianism and lies.
So, Anne, earlier on we distinguished between, say, this like hard Stalinism, which is like nakedly apologetic and anti-truth, and say some kind of soft Stalinism in which one might acknowledge that there were shortcomings with Stalinism and the Soviet Union, but still say, okay, this was, our one historical example of like a real socialist society, and so this is something we need to improve on and build upon and not reject. How does Marxist-Humanism, and how would you respond to that sort of soft Stalinism?
That's a very old line also, the gradualist idea that they're working on perfecting socialism in the Soviet Union. I always make fun of it, because they had 70 years and they didn't get beyond we're working on it. I don't know if you remember, but right before the fall of the Soviet Union, people were saying Gorbachev's going to make everything better, and he's going to introduce democracy. So we're going to still have the same factory system of exploitation of labor, but now there's going to be factory committees. Of course, they were supposed to be they were at the start of the revolution. They lost all their power. But they say, well, now we're going to mix in democracy, and that's going to make all the difference. This was the CP line and all their similar organizations line. And it just has no basis, in fact. And again, you have to read a little Marx and see that you can't be a little bit capitalist and a little bit uncapitalist. That you either have production working under the laws of capitalism, and which of course is the getting the maximum labor out of the workers and paying them the minimum. And unless that's the hallmark, while that's the hallmark, you still have capitalism. So this gradual notion, I think, is just a fiction. That's not how change happens. Change happens when you overthrow the current society and completely tear it up, root and branch, and start something totally new human relations, new work relations, new man-woman relations, new everything. And it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not easy, and there's no automatic road from overthrowing the old system and being able to create a new system. But that's why we talk all the time about the self-development of movements, not of people in particular, but of movements. The revolutionary movements need to become smart and learned enough to be able to take control of their own lives in their own hands and work out what that new society will look like. And to me, that's the answer when people say, oh, if you don't like Russia, can you point to some other society that's good? If you can't point to it, then I'm not going to believe in it. And you have to get people to think outside of what the existing choices are. And this has to do with the anti-war movement and the leftists and everybody. If they limit their thinking to what they can see in front of them, they're never going to break free of capitalism or this society in any way, shape, or form. So it's a very difficult project that we've taken on at MHI, but we don't think there's any other path to socialism.
You are listening to Radio Free Humanity. In just a moment, we will return with our interview about tankies. But as we do in every episode, we're going to take a couple minutes for Anne to tell us a little bit about Marxist-Humanist Initiative.
Hello, this is Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
Well, again, if people want to watch the video of this panel, they can go to the Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org website and just search for George Mason, and you'll find the panel from May of 2019 video of it. I mean, for me, one of the most striking things about the panel was not just that there were all these students with these tankiest positions, but that amongst the adults on the panel, Andrew, you yourself, and then Boots Riley and Rick Wolf. Andrew, you're the only person who is seen responding critically at all to these Stalinist positions, and Boots Riley and Rick Wolf are pretty appallingly quiet or even encouraging of these positions.
Boots Riley is either a member of or very close to the Progressive Labor Party, which is unreconstructed Maoist. I mean, and he was basically, whenever there was like some criticism of like the USSR or something, he'd go, oh, well, that was, in the Khrushchev period, in other words, Stalin is all hunky-dory. It's the revisionist post-Stalin era that's got everything to blame. So, I mean, he was putting out that kind of line. The much scarier, much more insidious line is the so-called soft Stalinism. I think is actually worse than the upfront Stalinism. The upfront Stalinism, at least you know what they're about and what they aim for. People like Rick Wolf, they remind me of like, the responsible Republicans who, don't say anything when Trump does his both sides about Charlottesville, and the family separations and the genocide in Puerto Rico. But they go, we really wish he wouldn't tweet so much. And that's Rick Wolf on the USSR. Well, we really wish, the Stalin hadn't tweeted so much. They made mistakes. You don't specify what the mistakes are. And all of a sudden, all these people who are supposedly, thinking about class and have an understanding of class analysis and class struggle, when it comes to those societies, all of a sudden you get this undifferentiated we, they, these societies, and in Wolf's case, it's completely disingenuous because he co-authored with Stephen Resnick a book in 2002 that argued that the USSR was was a state capitalist society. And that meant it had a capitalist ruling class. It was not a socialist society. But he gets to this platform and he's playing to the tanky rafters, and he's calling, these things socialist societies, and we're getting the old, monthly review apologetics. They weren't perfect, but it's really, I found it despicable because it's an attempt, on the one hand, not to criticize these societies. So you get all the tankies on your side and the anti-imperialists on your side, but then you can't be tarred as one of them either. It's Weasley. It's a very Weasley way of operating, and I think we're dealing with a class struggle, between capitalism in its private market form and its Stalinist, state authoritarian, totalitarian form. We're dealing with that against, masses of people who want to be free, workers and so on. This is a class struggle. And the key is to any class struggle is, which side are you on? And this is what they try to avoid. So I think this is much worse than the Boots Rileys and the Bennett Shoups, the graduate student, and all of those people, because it makes it look, well, just like the respectable Republicans are more insidious than the Trumpites.
And, Andrew, for me, one of the most striking things about the panel, and of course, people should go to the MHI website and watch it themselves and make their own judgments, but for me, one of the most striking things was that not only did Rick Wolff not want to challenge any of the tanky positions that were being offered in the panel, but when you, Andrew, offered some criticism, Rick Wolff got upset and attacked you.
Yeah, the exact context is I made a distinction between the vision of liberatory socialism and the systems that usurped the name, post-totalitarian control and unfreedom. I said that the cause of socialism is going to suffer when these things are confused. And Wolff responded, quote, the desire to have a debate over who's genuinely in the club and who's genuinely out of it, I think that's done more damage than almost anything else.
This has to be denounced very, very loudly, because there's no way to clarify thinking on what socialism is, what we're for, except by making these distinctions. And that has to be challenged at any left event. I mean, I have that problem all the time. Whatever we go to, left forum, any other conference, historical materialism, any meeting, anti-war meeting or anti-Trump meeting, they always talk about we believe this, we have to defeat the Trumpites, but they never say who we is and what the differences among them are. And they always assume it's fine that we all get together. I mean, we act in coalitions to defeat Trump, but they act as if what we're for is all the same, and that's easy to know, and that every leftist knows ABC, and it's just a total baloney.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. Please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to hear other episodes, to leave a comment, make a donation, or to read other articles about similar topics. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms, so please do and share with friends. Thank you for listening.